Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to a stretch of Canadian wilderness just west of Timmins, Ontario, Canada. Just outside of the Folliet area, the Groundhog River has drawn the scrutiny of energy and mining corporations for the possibility of it containing valuable resources. With an elevation of 1,200 feet above sea level, this area is flat and hosts thick forests containing black and white spruce, balsam fir, jack pine, tamarack, white birch, quaking aspen, and balsam poplar trees. Common animals here include moose and woodland caribou roaming the marshes and forests, while wolves and black bears stalk them from the shadows. The dancing wildflowers, playful otters, and beautiful songbirds belie the danger of this scenic place that simmers beneath the surface. In June of 2013, Dr. Rob Foster was performing a point count for songbirds along the Groundhog River. Foster was a bona fide academic, having received the Rhodes Scholar while attending Oxford University, and parlayed his talents into the creation of a consulting firm named Northern Bioscience. His business relied on contracts for wildlife surveys, which led him to isolated and uninhabited corners of the world. He had completed studies on creatures ranging in size, from dung beetles in Africa to lions, and was used to the exposure and danger of the job. Now, Foster wasn't naive as to the risk he was exposed to when he visited the boreal forests of Ontario. He knew that black bears were nothing to trifle with, so he came prepared with bear spray whenever he ventured into the woods. In his 30 years in the bush, he had never had to spray a bear, but there was a first time for everything, especially when it comes to bears. As Foster rummaged through his backpack while sitting along the edge of a marsh, putting away his field notebook, a noise drew his attention. He watched as a large black bear emerged from the bushes about 80 yards away from him, on the other side of the marsh. Knowing that black bears are seldom dangerous, the scientist stood to his full height of 6 feet 2 inches tall. To appear as large as possible, he lifted his backpack overhead, while he roared. As soon as the bear spotted Foster, it dashed straight toward him. Now fully vested in the game of chess with the bear, Foster dashed toward the stream that separated the two, in a show of bravado, expecting the bear to break off its charge. As Foster approached, he pulled his bear spray out of its hip holster, and waited to spray the bear until he was within a few yards for maximum effect. The bear and the scientist arrived at the stream bank about the same time. Now separated by only 2 yards, the bear turned back and forth, seemingly uncertain of how to cross the shallow water. After a few seconds, the black bear jumped across the stream, and Foster let him have a short blast from near point-blank range, right in the eyes, nose, and mouth. Immediately affected by the irritant, the black bear turned and jumped back over the stream, and seemed to be in a pain-induced retreat from its ill-fated attack. Foster likely believed this would be the end of the confrontation, and quickly hurried back to his backpack, and searched for a knife he typically carried with him. After realizing he'd left it behind in the shuffle, he retrieved his Leatherman multi-tool as an ineffective substitute. As he flicked out the 2-inch blade on the multi-tool, Foster's heart sank with the realization of just how inadequate it would be in his defense. His mind briefly drifted to his wife and 2 children, and how they would be impacted should things go poorly for him. Now somewhat armed, Foster turned back in the bear's direction to see it returning toward him in a gallop. Executing the same process over once again, Foster ran back toward the stream, yelling and roaring. Now separated again by the stream, the bear had the same conundrum of how to get across the stream and eventually leapt over it. From only a few yards away, Foster released a second short blast from his bear spray. With a double dose of irritant, the black bear circled away from Foster, which gave him time to make his way back to the middle of the clearing. As the scientist kept an eye on the bear, he could see it try to sneak around behind him. It was clearly inept at doing this without cover, and almost amused the man with its behavior. After putting on a good sneak, the black bear rushed from the brush toward Foster in another charge. The man once again roared and charged toward the bear to within a few yards and held his spray out in front of him. By now the bear had made a clear association with the presence of the can and the pain in its eyes and nose. The bear spun around and retreated several yards, with Foster mocking a boisterous attack from behind. Each time Foster advanced toward the bear, it would run a short distance and try to find cover to circle behind him. Foster would charge toward it again, and once again the bear would flee, then try to hide himself for another circling attack. Each time Foster rushed toward the bear, he knew he had to be careful not to trip and fall. If he lost his footing, the bear might see it as an opportunity to pounce on him, so each advance and retreat offered its own perils. For the next 15 minutes, this game of cat and mouse continued as Foster began to worry that the bear would stop its stalk on him. He reached into his pocket and found his GPS, which had charted his route into the location, and now would guide him back to his vehicle. Foster also took a few photos of the bear, knowing the images would provide evidence as to what happened to him, should the bear kill him. Each time Foster would begin to leave, the bear would sneak up behind him and try to ambush him, forcing the man to stop and chase the bear off again. Foster knew he had to find a way to make this situation work for him and allow him to get back to his truck. He devised a brilliant plan to continually push the bear ahead of him as he hiked back toward his vehicle. Eventually making his way to a patch of alders, Foster held the can in front of him as he crawled through the tangled mess while he charged toward the bear. As they crested a small rise, the bear closed to within 4 feet of Foster, causing him to discharge his bear spray a third time. The bear fled once again a short distance, but circled back to stalk the man once more. As the chase continued, the two eventually came out on a stretch of forest. Foster contemplated climbing into a tree, but knew the bear could also climb, so he bagged that idea. At one point, the bear was so frustrated that it stood on its hind legs and placed its front paws on either side of a tree. It let out a loud woof, seemingly venting its disappointment on how this attack was going. After stalking up behind Foster one more time, the scientists charged toward the bear again. Now only a few feet and a small pine tree separated the adversaries. Foster would aim the bear spray toward the bear, and it would shrink back and peer around the other side of the tree. Foster would then aim the spray at the other side of the tree, only to have the bear swap sides once again in a very serious game of peekaboo. As Foster tried to conserve his bear spray, he was close enough to see the bear's right eye was now swollen and half shut due to the effects of the spray. Foster decided one more good blast might convince the bear to find an easier meal, so he sprayed the bear once more from only a few feet. By now the breeze had picked up a bit, and the irritant had blown back into Foster's eyes. Now he was coughing and gagging just like the bear. For the next 30 minutes, Foster was paralleled as he retreated toward his vehicle. The bear would occasionally attempt to circle back behind the man, but each time he was met with a roaring charge and sticks and stones. Knowing he had to keep the bear between where he wanted to go and himself, Foster had to circle the bear on occasion, seemingly reversing the roles in the stalk. He refused to let the bear feel like it had an advantage, and knew that if he pursued the bear, it would keep it in a defensive mindset. As the pair proceeded through the trees, each time the bear charged, it would flee further than it had previously, before looping around in another attempt at stalking Foster. It appeared to be losing interest in pursuing the man, and eventually ended up not circling back on him after its final circling stalk on him. Foster made it back to his truck in safety without injury. The secret to his success was staying on his feet and purchasing an extra large can of bear spray containing 300 grams of irritant. Upon returning to his truck, he estimated that he had one more spray left in his canister, and that was about it. As for the bear, nothing was stated that Ontario officials attempt to locate it or cull it from the population. I guess they figured that the bear had learned a painful lesson about bear spray and hoped it wouldn't need another one. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. If Foster hadn't purchased the extra large container of bear spray, how do you think things would have turned out? Does this episode make a good argument for packing a firearm while going into the forest? Did Foster survive because he was an animal researcher familiar with what the bear would try to do as it stalked him? I would hate to play Dr. Foster in a game of chess. I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Flathead National Forest in northwest Montana. Glacier National Park abuts the forest, as it is only 8 miles away as the crow flies. Just 2 miles north of the town of Columbia Falls, the national forest blankets mountains that reach 3,000 feet in elevation. The rolling hills are deceptive, as they seem peaceful and safe, and are crowded with ponderosa and lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, western larch, and quaking aspen. The berries here are a very important source of food for local wildlife and include huckleberry, thimbleberry, chokecherry, and gooseberry. The North Fork Road heads north toward Glacier and is immediately enveloped by forest, bushes, and relative wilderness. Hanging west on Cedar Creek Road brings the woods even closer and the help and safety of civilization farther away. This kind of country brings a peaceful feeling to visitors as the harmony of nature blossoms all around them. But this illusion lulls many visitors into a disarming state of mind, one that can put them in a dangerous position with one of its most dangerous denizens. On Thursday, July 18, 2024, a 72-year-old man, whom we will refer to as Mike, was heading out of Columbia Falls to gather huckleberries. He wasn't packing bear spray, but was packing his sidearm, as sources indicate. The specifics of his sidearm aren't yet available, but given he was a Montanan, it's fairly safe to assume that he packed something bigger than a .40 caliber, and likely loaded with hard-cast bullets. If you're not a berry picker, a little background on berry picking culture is needed to understand today's episode. There are several ground rules or suggestions to being a good berry picker, and they generally center around courtesy. Most pickers use a bucket to collect their goodies in, as they meander the slopes, oblivious to anything but where the next juicy berry is located. Visually sorting through the unripe berries from the ripe ones can be done at a glance, but that glance takes your attention and focus. One of the best tips on proper berry picking instructs pickers to get off the road and leave some for the next visitor. Crowding the shoulder of the road nearby favored berry patches is frowned upon, and hogging all the berries is rude, especially to black bears and grizzly bears. Huckleberries make up about half of the diet for hundreds of grizzly bears residing around Glacier, and hoarding their food can lead to catastrophic circumstances. As Mike meandered the meadows and trod the trails, he slowly filled his berry basket with the small purple prizes. He was by himself and enjoyed the peace of being surrounded by nature's beauty and bounty. As Mike blissfully made his way through the berry patch, he silently made his way along a trajectory that would lead him into a perilous predicament. As he carefully selected his huckleberries, his picking was interrupted by the sudden appearance of a big brown blur from his peripheral vision. Before he could draw his sidearm, the angry sow grizzly knocked Mike to the ground, slashing and biting him furiously. Somehow he had the wherewithal to pull out his pistol and fire into the grizzly an unspecified amount of times, but not before she could impart serious injuries to him. After Mike's pistol helped her change her mind, the sow turned and searched for her cubs before departing. As soon as she disappeared, Mike gathered his senses and worked his way back to his feet. The damage she inflicted on his body was painful, and blood seeped from puncture wounds and gashes as he slowly made his way back toward the vehicle. I could find no source indicating how Mike made it to medical help, but the report of his attack set off a frenzy of investigators and media members. After listening to his account and examining evidence at the attack site, investigators chalked up the attack to the sow protecting herself and her cubs from a perceived threat. Her carcass was observed and recovered at the attack site. Game cameras were set out to see if her cubs could be located and to check in on their welfare. Authorities mulled over the possibility of finding sanctuaries that could accept the bears, or if they may be old enough to live independently of their sole protector and provider. Dylan Chabish, a spokesman for the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, issued a puzzling statement following the attack. He stated that the cubs may be left alone because they may have a better chance of survival than if they were euthanized. They may have a better chance of survival than if they were euthanized. The act of euthanization would ensure the cubs have zero chance of survival, but that fact seemed to be missed by the authorities. It wasn't long before the 3 orphaned cubs were observed on the game cameras. At the current time, there's been no statement regarding plans to capture the cubs or euthanize them. Speaking of cubs, our Cub Tier membership on Patreon, linked below, will give you ad-free early access to our episodes, and the $3 per month goes a long way in helping me continue to produce content like this. Authorities concluded with a statement regarding that the bears are active in the forests and around mountain towns. Mindfulness and the usual instructions about staying in groups, being noisy, and maintaining bear awareness may help forest visitors avoid confrontations with hungry or protective bears. Meanwhile, a few hours to the south, in the town of Gardner, a sow grizzly has been caught raiding cabins and seeking food sources near human population centers. The sow had no record of hostility toward people, but was deemed a problem bear due to her comfort and familiarity with human habitations. She was euthanized in an attempt to eliminate any potential for conflict with human beings. In recent sources, grizzly bears have been noted to exist in Montana, Alaska, Wyoming, and Idaho, and a surprise addition to this list is the state of Washington. Recent grizzly reintroduction efforts there are slated to reintroduce the bears to the North Cascade Mountains northeast of Seattle. An estimated 2,000 grizzly bears live in the corridor between Yellowstone National Park and the Canadian-U.S. border, and numbers have increased very rapidly in recent decades, with an absence of hunting seasons for population management. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think grizzly reintroduction in Washington state will lead to more grizzly bear and human conflicts? What could Mike have done to avoid this bear attack? Would bear spray have yielded a better outcome than Mike's pistol produced? The next time you're picking berries, will you leave a few for the bears? I think I'll stick to the store-bought berries, just in case. I'll gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us near the delta of the Nushagak River, around the town of Dillingham, Alaska. This area is very low in elevation, with few locations rising to over 100 feet above sea level. Given the low slope of the land, rivers and streams here wind slowly through the alders and tundra, leaving oxbows that rise and fall along with the tides. Nushagak is filled with chinook, coho, sockeye, chum, and pink salmon at various points of the summer, with the largest of the species, the king salmon, run peaking at midsummer. Nearby Bristol Bay is globally important, producing 50% of the worldwide salmon harvest and providing local fishermen with jobs. Salmon aren't the only fish in the Nushagak, as rainbow trout, northern pike, burbot, grayling, whitefish, and Arctic char are pulled from its cold waters by fishermen and bears. Caribou and moose are commonly observed here, and black bears, wolves, and brown bears prowl the shadows, seeking their next meal. Their survival isn't easy, and they must use all their tools to make it. On the evening of September 9, 2022, 40-year-old John Castile was hunting about 20 miles outside of his hometown, Dillingham. His family has lived here for 4 generations, and John worked as a commercial fisherman for the summer. His job freed up fall hunting season, which he enjoyed with his longtime hunting buddy Chad Feltz. Castile and Feltz had been waiting for tides to prevail, which would allow them to motor their aluminum skiff up the river to their spike camp. Felt's mother, whom we will refer to as Sandy, was a nurse, and a female friend, who we will call Nancy, accompanied the men on their trip. As the 4 Alaskans bounced and curved their way up the braided branches of the river, their pull-in at Portage Creek came into view. Knowing that it would soon be too dark to hunt, Sandy and Nancy agreed to stay at camp, while Castile and Feltz went upstream a bit to glass for moose. It is common for moose hunters here to harvest successfully, and the men heard of someone pulling one from near the area they were going to go scout. They had subsistence moose hunting permits, and had purchased brown bear tags, so their options for a successful hunt were high, as were their spirits. With their skiff tied off, the hunters climbed up the banks. Castile carried his trusty .270 hunting rifle, and Feltz carried an unspecified hunting rifle. Following stands of spruce and brush to avoid sinking into the muskeg, the men remained together before emerging onto an expanse of tundra. As the hunters walked toward the next stand of trees, Phelps drifted off to the right a bit, as Castile made a beeline for the trees. Castile was the one who was told of the location of the moose kill the previous week, and wanted to find the remains to see if a brown bear had discovered it yet. He thought he had a good idea of the gut pile's location, but his hunch was much more accurate than even he had thought. As Castile pushed his way through the brush, he suddenly saw dark fur through the brush in front of him, only a few yards. He froze in place and silently hoped that the previous moose hunters had left a patch of hide behind, but then he saw the dark patch move. Knowing he was much too close to try a stealthy retreat, Castile's concern grew as a huge brown bear head appeared from the brush. As the bear stared at him, head-on, from only 25 yards, Castile shouldered his rifle and fired straight into the bear's massive chest, likely out of sheer panic. Now I bet I know what you're thinking. A .270 is way too small to take down a giant brown bear, especially from close range, and you're right. I've harvested a moose in Idaho with my .270, but my shot placement went through both lungs. It still took the 800-pound bull a minute or so to die, but Castile didn't have a few minutes, and hadn't hit the bear through both lungs. As the giant Bruin's face shifted into an angry grimace, Castile worked the action on his rifle to chamber another round. He fired into the bear a second time, before the bear charged toward him, now unfazed by 2 high-powered rifle rounds to the chest. Allowing panic to guide him to fire into the brown bear at a bad angle, his next decision led Castile into another major mistake. He turned around and began running from the bear as it flashed toward him. After a few steps, he tripped, sending his rifle sailing through the air and landing a few yards from where he lay on his stomach. Now completely defenseless, Castile knew he was in for one hell of a chewing. He interlaced his fingers and wrapped his arms around his head and neck. He was hoping the injured brown bear might forgive the wounds from his rifle, but one thing's for sure, brown bears aren't known for their mercy. It wasn't long before Castile felt the immense pressure of the bear's jaws on his left thigh. With jaws about 10 inches long that can open wide enough to engulf nearly any part of the human anatomy, the bear's 2-inch canines punched searing holes through his muscle and skin. Castile screamed in terror and pain as the brown bear bit repeatedly over the back of his left thigh. He felt the bear bite into his left arm just before the crack of a rifle sounded. Unbeknownst to Castile, Phelps had sprinted back to him and was looking for an angle to shoot the bear, but not wound his friend. Phelps walked up to within a few feet of the bear and fired his rifle 3 times into the frenzied bear before it stopped ripping and biting Castile. Having absorbed 5 rounds from close range with 2 different hunting rifles, the bear took a few steps backward as its wounds sapped its energy. It still stood for a few seconds before wobbling and then tipping over. The brown bear had died, and its carcass now lay on top of Castile's hunting rifle. Knowing killing the angry bear wasn't enough, Phelps ran to Castile's side as he worked at the buckle of his belt. Wrapping the belt around Castile's thigh, he improvised a tourniquet and began to work through his mental list required to rescue his buddy. The men had brought along an in-reach from Garmin, and Phelps used it to text Castile's father back in Dillingham. Knowing Castile would need immediate medical help to survive, Phelps tugged the .270 from beneath the dead grizzly and shot it once more, just to make sure, or perhaps out of spite. Tapping into some superhero level of adrenaline, Phelps grabbed onto his buddy's jacket and dragged him to his feet. Wrapping Castile's right arm around his neck, Phelps packed Castile several hundred yards toward the skiff. Castile was beset with a sudden and severe burst of pain in his left leg. The pain-numbing adrenaline of the experience may have worn off, and he was no longer in any shape to continue. Phelps knew that he could make better time if he left Castile behind, so he placed his .270 in his arms and sprinted toward the skiff. I know it seems illogical to leave an injured person behind, but Phelps' mother was a nurse and would know exactly what to do to save Castile's life. He covered the braided route to Spike Camp and was rushing back toward Castile within 30 minutes. As Phelps and his mother approached Castile, the inReach pinged with a reply text from Castile's father. It indicated that a Coast Guard helicopter had been directed to their location, but it would be delayed a few hours. Knowing they had time to address Castile's wounds and comfort him, they built a fire to keep him warm as they cleaned his wounds. They piled their coats on him to keep him from falling further into shock, but his wounds continued to bleed. As darkness crept across the land, the sound of helicopter rotors broke the eerie silence and brought hope. The helicopter crew loaded Castile on board and flew him to the small airport in Dillingham. Medical professionals at the clinic there were able to stabilize him enough for his flight to Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage. By the next day, Castile would endure one of several surgeries to repair the damage done by the brown bear's jaws. He was treated in critical care for 10 days, broken only by painful walks and brief visits with Feltz. On his visits, Feltz brought along pictures of the bear's skull and explained how he had made sure to harvest and retrieve the giant bear's hide and carcass in compliance with Alaska regulations. After allowing Feltz to recover the bear's carcass, an investigation revealed the fall from the prior successful moose hunter's moose carcass. The bear had attacked in protection of its food cache, and possibly out of aggravation by being shot by Castile. They did not comment on the presence of cubs. Speaking of cubs, our Cub Tier membership on Patreon, linked below, will give you ad-free early access to our episodes, and the $3 per month will go a long way in helping me continue to produce content like this. In 2022, there were at least 27 bear attacks in North America, with Alaska having at least 7 of those. One of them was the fatal brown bear attack on Army Staff Sergeant Seth Michael Plant. His attack was discussed in an episode on this channel, and I've linked to it in the video article below for your review. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think the bear would have attacked Castile if he hadn't shot it? Would it have attacked him if he hadn't run from it? Would the bear have succumbed to Castile's bullets before he died from his injuries? The next time you see a dark patch through the bushes, will you make sure it isn't a brown bear? I'm sure it will run through my mind. I'll gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.